We are ready to get started. We're so excited today to have Biundo, Anthony Betori, Monica Rivera, and J.R. Chester to present the workshop, Texas has new sex education standards. What does that mean for advocates? I'm going to turn it over to them for further introductions and to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you. We've been looking forward to this presentation for a long time, and we're excited to be here with our friends at TASA. My name is Anthony Betori, and before I introduce myself, just a couple of notes. So we would love to know from you all in the chat, if you could, where you're coming from, and if you work with youth, and if you do, what capacity you work with them in. I also wanted to let you know that throughout the session, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions. There'll be some dedicated time at the end as well. But if you have any questions in the meantime, do feel free to put those in the chat and we'll get to them as we can. So my name is Anthony Betori. I'm the Health Education Program Director at Healthy Futures of Texas. And I'm also a Bloomberg Fellow in Adolescent Health at Johns Hopkins University. I'm excited today to be presenting with some of my colleagues from Healthy Futures and Texas Campaign. And so Jen, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and really excited to be here. I'm Jen Biundo. I'm Director of Policy and Data for the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. So I do a lot of work at the legislature, working around access to health information and healthcare. And that recently, in the last couple of years, has involved a lot of work on sex education. And I will pass it over to my colleague at the Texas Campaign, J.R. Chester.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am J.R. I am brand new to the Texas Campaign, just a month in. I am a project director, and Texas is Ready is one of my babies, as well as the Texas Youth Friendly Initiative. I'm very excited to be a part of this and sharing all this information with you today. And I'm going to pass it to Monica with Healthy Futures of Texas.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Rivera. I am a director of school district health initiatives here at Healthy Futures of Texas. We are based in San Antonio. Sorry about that. And one of the things that I primarily focus on is helping school districts implement sexual health education at their local school level across Texas.
Thanks, everyone. So a little bit about Texas is Ready. We are a multi-agency partnership that was launched in 2020 to respond to the pending changes in Texas's health education curriculum, especially those regarding sex ed. So it's composed of 3 organizations: Healthy Futures of Texas, where Monica and I are from; the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy, where Jen and JR are from; and then the North Texas Alliance to Reduce Unintended Pregnancy in Teens, or Interrupt, in Dallas, where some of our other colleagues are from. So we'll get into Texas is Ready a bunch later in the presentation, but today we represent these 3 organizations. And there's a little picture of what sex ed looks like in Texas right now to set the foundation for today's session. It's important to know that health is required for all middle schoolers in Texas, but not for high schoolers. So high schools have the option of doing health. It used to be mandatory, it's not anymore. And data shows that probably about 25% of high school students end up taking health at some point. An estimated 17% of schools currently teach abstinence plus sex ed, which is abstinence plus is a term we'll be using throughout the session. It means that we start with abstinence as the most effective way to avoid pregnancy and STIs, but that young people do need to have information about contraception, about STIs, about healthy relationships, about context for making these decisions for when and if they do become sexually active in their lives. The other 83% or so of Texas schools either teach nothing at all or ineffective abstinence-only programs. So abstinence-only programs have not been shown to reduce pregnancy or STI infection. Today, we'll be talking about changes that go into effect in the 2022-2023 school year. So over the course of 2020 and 2021, we looked at a bunch of new standards with the state board and they approved some new standards, and we'll go over all that today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about sex education. So this is definitely our wheelhouse, and we're really excited to be sharing it with our TASA colleagues today. Sex ed helps students learn how to develop healthy relationships and social norms. It helps them to communicate boundaries. It helps them to understand the importance of understanding and respecting consent, critical to our conversation today. And it helps to improve discussions with trusted adults. Oh, I'm sorry for the typo on the slide. I just edited like 20 minutes ago. It helps to improve discussions with trusted adults and parents. And there is some evidence, a lot of evidence to suggest that these programs can delay sexual initiation, can reduce recent sexual activity, improve contraceptive use, decrease STIs and HIV, and prevent pregnancy. And yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jen. She's going to share some information about where Texas stands in terms of this data.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Yeah, so we see very strong support for evidence-based sex education from a really wide variety of partners, from all of the major medical groups, from the groups that work on things like sexual assault and domestic violence prevention, from the researchers and the academics. We see very strong support for the data and the evidence behind high quality sex ed for kids. But what we also see is that regular people also tend to support sex education. We know that some of the dialogue around sex education can get kind of controversial, it can get sort of high octane. But when we just ask regular people how they feel about sex education, we see very strong support across all sorts of demographic factors. And that includes right here in Texas. So in 2019, as we were getting into this work that we'll be talking about revising the minimum curriculum standards for sex ed, we wanted to see what Texas voters thought about it. So the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy contracted with a very well-known Republican polling firm because we wanted to make sure that there wasn't the thought that this polling data might somehow be partisan. And they reached out to Texas voters and they found very strong support for what we call abstinence plus sex ed in Texas. In fact, we found that 79% of respondents, including 72% of Republicans, support sex ed that, along with abstinence, also teaches students about condoms and contraception. We found that 88% of respondents, including 86% of Republicans, support information about consent for students in addition to learning about including respecting the boundaries set by other people about their bodies. I like to say that we have polling data that says that 84% of Americans like apple pie. So this polling data tells us that consent is actually more popular than apple pie in America, which I think is a pretty big endorsement. And then we actually also see support for inclusivity even right here in Texas. So 75% of respondents agree that to help prevent bullying of LGBTQ youth, schools should include standards around cultivating respect for all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that included 65% of Republicans. And so altogether, when we looked at support for what we call abstinence plus sex ed, there was not a single subpopulation that didn't have a majority of respondents that supported abstinence plus sex ed. It was really across the board. All right, so there is a lot of policy work that supports sex education at every level. And we don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but we want to make sure that you as advocates around sexual assault prevention and domestic violence prevention have kind of a good functional working knowledge of how this process works, because if you know how it works, that means you can step into this space and advocate for it. And if there's nothing else that you remember from this presentation, we want you to know that you are very important stakeholders in this work. You come from an on-the-ground place of expertise. You know how relationships, healthy or unhealthy, can help or hurt kids. And we would really appreciate you being at the table to support high-quality sex education in your communities. All right, so we have a lot of levels of control around sex education in Texas. So at the top of all of it is the Texas legislature. They write the statute that determines sex education in Texas. And we just had a whole lot of new statute that was approved in this most recent legislative session that we'll talk about shortly. The legislature also determines the graduation credit requirements. So you heard Anthony mention that we no longer have a graduation requirement at the high school level for health education, which is where sex ed tends to be delivered. However, we do have a requirement for health education at the middle school level, and we do have sex ed content in middle school now. We have the State Board of Education. If you've never heard of the State Board of Education, don't feel bad. A lot of people haven't. This is a 15-member elected body, and they set policy for school districts across the state. So 15 people. And one of their tasks is approving these minimum curriculum standards, which they just did in November 2020 for health education. They also approve instructional materials for each class. And in fact, last week, they convened the first review panel that will look at all of the new textbooks and instructional materials that will deliver this new health content. And then we've got the Texas Education Agency. They do the on-the-ground work to support school districts in the SVOE. But ultimately in Texas, we have a lot of local control around sex education. So it's the local school districts, it's all 1,200 plus across the state, that will select the actual sex education and health education curriculum. They'll train their teachers to deliver the curriculum, or they'll contract with an outside agency to do it, and they'll determine which electives to offer and whether or not they'll even offer health at the high school level. And then finally, we have a group called School Health Advisory Councils. Again, if you've never heard of School Health Advisory Councils or SHACs, again, don't feel bad. A lot of people don't know they exist. This is a volunteer group, and under state law, every school district is required to have one. And the SHACs are charged with making sure that community values are represented in health education class. They have a lot of different duties around a lot of topics like mental health, opioid prevention, recess policy. But around sex ed, they are charged with making a recommendation to the school board on which sex education curriculum to adopt. So as you can see, there are a lot of different people that are making decisions around sex ed. But in the next session of this presentation, Anthony is going to talk about what the State Board of Education did around the changes to sex education minimum curriculum standards. So Anthony, back to you.
Thanks, Jen. And I did get some feedback from our translators that we're talking a bit fast. So if we skipped anything, or if there's some gaps in what was translated, that's a great time to use the chat box and we can fill in those gaps. I think it's okay to tell everyone that we underestimated how much time we have to leave a lot of time for questions. So feel free to take it. So a little bit about the process. So in November of 2020, for the first time in more than 2 decades, the State Board of Education updated the minimum curriculum standards for health education. We like to say that that was the year, or point out that that was the year that Titanic was in theaters. Here in San Antonio, we also mention it was the year that Selena was in theaters. So it's been a while. The reason why they are not updated as often as math, for example, or science, is simply because those are such huge content areas, and there's only time to look at health every couple of decades. So schools will need to implement these new standards in 2022 and 2023, that school year. And we will get into a little bit more about what that means. Next slide, please. We wanted to show you all some of the many organizations that supported the revisions to the health standards. They include our partners at TASA, as well as the Texas Medical Association, the Texas Council on Family Violence, and all of these organizations did so much work. They prepared briefs that they sent to state board members. They did research. They got people to give testimony. It was a huge, huge effort. And we're very grateful to everyone who put time and energy into this. I wanted to show you, when we're talking about these Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills standards, what that actually looks like. So what is on your screen is what's called a student expectation, or SE. And so this is what a teacher sees. They have to, this is just a random example from the health TEEX, but it shows that the student needs to do this. The student is expected to generate a personal health profile using appropriate technology. And so the stage we're at now is translating these student expectations to school districts and helping them get the curriculum they need to actually teach these things. So if we were to think about an analogy for math, for example, the student is expected to understand how to add and subtract. The curriculum comes after that, the actual lesson plan that teaches somebody how to add and subtract. So when we're talking about the student expectations, we're talking about phrases like these. So let's talk a bit about the good news from the TEEX revisions. The new standards, for the first time ever, will include information on puberty, menstruation, anatomy, and reproduction. They will also include medically accurate information on contraception and STI prevention, including screening and treatment. That's a huge improvement. While the teen pregnancy rates in a lot of Texas continue to fall, STI rates, sexually transmitted infection rates, are rising, especially in some infections like gonorrhea, chlamydia, and syphilis. There will also be information on healthy relationships, including respecting the boundaries of other people. Boundaries is a really key word that I'll get to a bit more in a second. And the standards are now offered in middle school when all students take health class. So we're talking about 5.5 million students in the Texas public school system that over the course of their middle school career will get this information. The bad news is that while there is language around boundaries, there is no language around the word consent. And that is probably a whole other webinar. So if you want to get into, excuse me, why that's not there, we'll let you know. There's also no language that's inclusive of LGBTQ youth. That language would sound something like a student would be able to understand different sexual orientations, or a student would understand not to bully people who have different gender identities. Those terms are not included in the TEEX, even though there was a lot of advocacy around that and a lot of strong leadership from some state board members. But it's important to remember that these are minimum standards. So districts have the choice to teach beyond these TEEX. Any district in Texas can add in information about sexual orientation or consent. It's always an option. And if you want to take a screenshot of this slide, we're not going to go over every word of it, but just to highlight a bit about the changes from old to new, you can see each of the main categories here. So feel free to screenshot this and keep it on your computer. In terms of the major change in terms of puberty is that it's now introduced earlier at a time that's more appropriate when more people actually are experiencing puberty. It also covers postpartum depression, which we're really excited about. That's a huge improvement. The old TEEX had very minimal content on HIV and STIs. That's been improved. The old TEEX focused very heavily on abstinence as perhaps the only method or one of the only methods. The new TEEX provide a wider framework. And the new TEEX do have a lot more information about healthy relationships, which is great. And next, we wanted to point out some specific TEEX related to domestic violence and sexual assault. So my colleague JR is going to put into the chat a document that outlines specifically what the TEEX say on these topics for your reference. But generally, they cover identifying abuse and assault, which was, I would say, I think Jen and Monica might agree, it was definitely because of people like TASA making a huge statement, but identifying abuse and assault, building healthy boundaries, forming healthy relationships, and the importance of things like communications in relationships, and defining and identifying characteristics of human trafficking. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Jen to discuss statute.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And we'll share that document that has all of the DVSA related TEEX at the end of the meeting, just because I know if we share it now, everyone has to read it right away, and don't want to lose everyone. So we've talked about the changes that were made at the State Board of Education that were approved in November of 2020. And so now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the changes that were made to sex education statute in this most recent legislative session that wrapped up at the end of May. So before we talk about the changes that were made, let's talk about what didn't change. So state law has a lot of language within the education code about sex education. We have a lot more verbiage about sex education than we do about a topic like algebra or biology. So one of the most key things that state law says about sex education is that we have to start with abstinence. So Texas law says that any district that teaches sex education has to teach students that abstinence is the best and preferred choice of behavior for unmarried people of school age. They have to say that it's the only 100% effective method of preventing pregnancy and STIs. They have to spend more time teaching abstinence than anything else. However, we allow districts to teach about additional topics like contraception, like STI prevention, like healthy relationships. And in fact, like Anthony was saying, these new TEEX do have content that specifically requires districts to teach these things. However, under state law, any education that's provided on topics like contraception and condoms has to teach human use reality rates instead of theoretical laboratory rates. So we call that in the medical field, we talk about actual use failure rates. And then we have a lot of language about local control within state law. So our statute lays out the process for curriculum adoption, parent notification, and parent rights. And this is where we saw very significant changes in the most recent legislative session. All right, so what changed? We had a number of bills that were filed around sex ed, largely in response to the big changes that we saw in the curriculum standards at the State Board of Education. We had several bills that moved. None of these bills were quite going to make it over the finish line. If you're familiar with legislative work, you know that there are a lot of deadlines that result in bills dying, and these bills all hit deadlines. However, in the very last few days of session, several bills were attached as amendments to a school finance bill that was considered a must-pass bill. And so that's how this statute actually got into law. So the amendments that were put onto HB 1525, the school finance bill, had these provisions. The biggest change that we saw, and the one that we're most concerned about, is the opt-in provision. So for many years, parents have had the right to opt their children out of sex ed. So if a parent didn't want their child to take sex ed, they could pull them from the class without penalty. The change that we saw in the most recent legislative session is that parents now have to actively provide consent to opt their children into sex ed class. School districts, just like they would do a notification for a field trip and get consent, they now have to get that active consent for sex ed. The area where this is concerning is not the parents who don't want their children to get sex ed. What's concerning is the kids that just slip through the cracks. Our concern is that we have a lot of busy and overwhelmed parents. We also have a lot of disengaged parents. The concern is that the parent might just not see the permission slip in the bottom of the backpack or in the bottom of their email inbox. I know I've missed things in my kid's backpack before. So we are going to be working very closely with school districts on ways that they can ensure that they're reaching as many families as possible, and also tracking how many families just don't respond at all.
Hi, Jen. We have a question asking, what does opt-in mean for foster children?
So that's a great question. We know that children in the foster system already have a lot of barriers when it comes to sex ed. We know that they are very mobile. They move from school to school with great frequency. They might not even be in school in that 3-week period when sex ed was being taught. So we know they're already at risk of missing sex ed. We know that they have higher rates of pregnancy and STIs than their peers outside of the foster system. So what the opt-in will mean for children in the foster system is whoever their current legal guardian is will be responsible for making sure that that paperwork has been signed and submitted back to the school. So if it's their foster parent that they're living with, that foster parent would be responsible for turning in that paperwork. If they're in a residential treatment center, it would be that caseworker or other person who's responsible for their other legal and medical documents. But we're definitely especially concerned about that population. All right, so the next big thing that changed was the district adoption process for sex ed. So under this new law, this process of sex ed adoption has gotten a little bit longer and more formalized. Districts have to adopt a formal policy of how they will adopt sex ed. They now have to have a board resolution directing that School Health Advisory Council, or SHAC, to take up the sex ed process. And they have to adopt sex ed at an open meeting by a record vote. We don't have a lot of concern with that section. It seems generally like good open governance. It does make the process a little bit longer. So we're trying to work with school districts to make sure that they know to leave enough time for this whole process. We also had some changes around SHAC meeting procedures. So this bill started out in a way that could have been really harmful. The original statutory language that was filed would have taken these parent or community volunteer groups and turned them into governmental entities. So the bills as filed would have designated school health advisory councils as governmental entities. That would have made them subject to Open Records Acts, Open Meetings Acts. It would have been kind of like designating the PTA as a government group, which would have been a huge issue for anyone who serves on a SHAC. We worked extensively with the bill author. We got a lot of changes made to that bill, and that was dialed back. And so now the requirement is that SHACs have to post notice of their meetings. They have to post meeting minutes online. That is good policy. That's good open governance. And we see that a lot of SHACs were already doing that voluntarily because that's a good way to run any sort of meeting system. There was also a requirement made that SHAC meetings have to be recorded through either audio or video recordings. We have heard from some SHAC groups that they're a little concerned about that. Maybe they don't want their recording to be posted online, but that is something that school districts will have to navigate. And when SHACs are making recommendations around sex ed, they have to have 2 public meetings. So that gives the community a chance to provide input at those public meetings. We also saw some changes around parent notification. Parents will have more extensive notification of what sex ed is being taught. And again, we think that's good. We want parents to know what's going on in the classroom. There's also more curriculum availability. Parents have always had the right to review curriculum, and we've made it a little bit easier for parents to get a hold of that curriculum. And in fact, they can even purchase the curriculum. Let's see. So any questions about what happened in the legislative session? All right. So there was another bill that was separate from all of this that would have provided instruction on dating violence prevention to all middle and all high school students. This was a bipartisan bill. It was filed by a Democrat, Senator West, and had very strong bipartisan support in the House and Senate. It would require school districts to have some additional procedures for reporting violence and abuse. They would have to have some procedures for assisting students who made an outcry of dating violence or abuse. Generally, again, very good policy. This bill was vetoed by the governor because it did not include a provision that would let parents opt their children out of this instruction. And this is a bill that would have required students to get educated on abuse committed by family members. It seems likely that a parent who is abusing their child might opt them out of a class teaching them that child abuse is wrong. So we do have some concerns about that. That bill was refiled in the special session. If you've been following the news, you know that the special session has kind of melted down. So we're keeping an eye on how this bill will go in future sessions. So what happens next? We had these big changes to sex education curriculum standards. We had some fairly significant changes to the laws around sex ed. And now school districts have to put all of this into place. So the State Board of Education is preparing to select the instructional materials that will teach health education and sex education. Every school district is going to have to pick their curriculum that covers these new TEKS. And of course, they also have the option to teach beyond the TEKS. They have the option to include content that's inclusive of LGBTQ youth and also teaches about consent. And so this is the place where local advocacy becomes really essential. So this is the place where we need local communities to be in conversations with their school districts about what they think should be taught in schools. And so I'm going to pass this over to Monica to talk about ways that you as advocates can be involved.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jen. I wanted to point out to everyone that I'm really glad that we have a large variety of people all from across Texas. And it seems to me that you all are very involved with your youth and your young people in your communities and the way of life that they are living. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we focused on in this presentation is give you the opportunity to learn how you as community members can take steps to take action in this issue, which is sexual health education. One of the things that we wanted to make sure everyone knew is that the first thing is you are here already. You're already listening about what the new standards are and what they mean. So you are already taking the action of getting educated and becoming involved so that you can properly go out into the community and tell people of these things that are happening in our community and across Texas. The next thing we'd love for you all to go out into the world and do is to advocate. So most of you already know the impacts of sexual assault and other unhealthy relationship patterns that happen among young people. And so it's important that you take a step to go into the community and advocate and speak to the people in the shack, or also just take part in the shack committee meetings. The good part about these new expectations for shack committees, they have to post those dates out there so that people can go and hopefully attend these meetings. So if you don't directly work with young people, you most likely already have a family member, a cousin, a sister who is in the middle school or high school level education. So you may want to actually, look up their school district, see who's leading their shack, and think about maybe attending one of those shack meetings and becoming an advocate for sexual health education. The last point that we wanted to make sure that you all knew is that Texas is Ready is really going to be networking with across Texas and other partners who are really involved in this type of work, so that you know that if there are questions, if you are working on a shack committee or already wanting to think about building a community of support towards sexual health education and you feel like you need more resources, keep us in mind and definitely reach out to us to see how we can support you all in this process so that we can ensure that all of our young people are receiving education so that where they can live a healthy life and actually be productive in a healthy relationship. Can we please go to the next slide? Thank you. And I realized I was speaking a little fast, so I'm going to slow down a bit. The point here for getting educated, as I mentioned earlier, is learning about what is happening at your local school district. I spoke earlier about how maybe you don't directly work with young people. Maybe you have somebody in your family that is at the middle school or high school level. Your local school district actually has a school board that shapes the educational programs in your community. Those members of that school board are advocates for public education, and they grow your community for public schools. So if you do know a school board member in your community, definitely have a conversation with them and let them know, hey, these new things are coming our way. What are we doing to improve these standards, this type of education in our community? Once the board does make a decision, the board does link the role to engage the community, both students, staff, parents, and media in ways that promote continued constructive discussions and generate positive community interest in the efforts of public schools. So as we talked about earlier, the SHACs and the school boards do post public, public dates of when these school board meetings do happen. So there's definitely opportunity for you to become engaged, and also sit on the at the school board meeting and listen to the things that the school board is deciding on, and definitely give your input if there's something that raises a red flag, or you definitely want to give your experience with the population that you currently work with in your community. Thank you, Jen. So getting involved, as I said, really means, taking the time and getting involved in that school health advisory council. They have a key role in the process of implementing the new adopted health TEEX. They are expected to review all these new standards, review all these new options of curriculum that do hit these TEEX, and also go above and beyond. As Anthony mentioned in his section, there are possibilities that school districts can take ownership of even elevating the level of education for their young people in regards to consent, in regards to LGBTQ community, and any other important healthy relationship concept that the school district wants to ensure that their young people do receive. So schools' activities solicit parent involvement in community engagement resources and services to respond more effectively to health-related needs of students. So one of the things that I always ask is, when I do a presentation at SHAC committees, which I normally do very much, I always ask, who are your members? Are they diverse? Are they from all kinds of work environments? Just to ensure that they're getting a well-rounded perspective on different issues among the community. Because if you only have administrators or only have a couple of parents, you're not getting a very well-rounded view of what are the actual issues in the community. So again, the majority of the SHAC members must be parents who are not employed by the district. That is the goal. However, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes, unfortunately, due to low resources, lower income communities, there are not as many parents on those SHAC committees. So the opinion can be skewed about whether or not we need more improved sexual health standards. And this is why we're here. We're here to talk to the people who see these experiences where young people are being affected by unhealthy relationships. And it's an opportunity for you to voice out your experience and also what you're seeing in your community, and how you can, the SHAC can really take a step to improving those situations. Advocate, contact your trustees. As I mentioned earlier, board members are the link to this whole process. Start communicating to them about how these new standards are coming, and tell your school board members that you do support abstinence plus sex ed. One of the things that is important is for you to also do the work of telling people, it's not only about abstinence plus sex ed or just sex ed, it's about wanting to help our young people become healthy civilians that live in healthy relationships, not only with their partners, but with everyone that they engage with, and also learn how to communicate healthy boundaries and improve the level of respect among young people as they move about their life and growing up. Things you can say: youth who receive comprehensive sex ed delay the onset of sexual activity longer than youth that do not. States who teach abstinence plus sex ed have lower teen pregnancy rates than states who teach abstinence only sex ed. And it is important for students to learn about healthy relationships and communication. So one of the things that I always say is because Texas focuses so much on abstinence, a lot of schools automatically revert to abstinence-only education. Again, it is a key point for you all to, if you have the opportunity, advocate on your SHAC committees to your school board members that you support abstinence plus sex ed. So the last point that we wanted to make sure you all understood is networking, building or joining a coalition of parents, students, and community members who support sex ed. So maybe you are not a direct parent of a young person in your local school district, but perhaps you can help a local group of young people who can come together and really advocate within their school district to speak to either school board members or even the SHAC committee. Or you can also, get involved with the work that we're doing at Texas is Ready. And one of the things that we at Healthy Futures of Texas and Interrupt, we have a youth advisory council. And they all come together and talk about these issues regarding sexual health education, and they advocate to local public hearings or also at the state level. So I really encourage you, if you can, continue networking and build that coalition of parents, students, and community members so that we can continue supporting sex ed in our communities.
Okay,
And
so
now
here's
I'm going to turn it over to JR.
Okay, thank you so much, Monica. So what we are doing currently to get this information out is we are in presentations, much like this one here today, but we're also hosting webinars called TeexTalk. We've had, we launched our very first one just last month, July 21st, and the feel of it was very much like this. It was helping people to understand what is happening with sex ed in Texas, why it's happening, the policy guru Jen giving all the background and the data, because people are, either have never heard about these changes or they've heard a little bit and they're trying to understand the how and the why behind it and what it specifically means for them. So TeexTalk just opens up a space to come hear, learn, ask questions, share your concerns, network, get your resources, and figure out how we can work together as the Texas is Ready Coalition and our school districts. So our next TeexTalk will be September 9th. It'll be kind of the next steps, right? So we know where we are, we know how it came to be, and now what can we do about it to be more successful? So that's, we'll share more about that on the Texas is Ready, how to get registered for that if you're interested or if you'd like to share this information with someone who may want to come learn more or ask questions. And then Texas is Ready. We keep saying Texas is Ready. So Texas is Ready, as you can see, is a grant-funded collaboration between, like Anthony said at the very beginning, between ourselves at Texas Campaign, Healthy Futures of Texas, and Interrupt. And we're building this coalition. We have new partners who are joining us to provide technical and training assistance. And the premise has gone from, as Jen described earlier, the understanding the process, the testimony, taking a stance for why abstinence plus education is important and necessary. Now that's said and done, right? The TEEKs are in place, it's been decided. So now it's like, okay, now we're transitioning to how do we implement this successfully? How do we help school districts be successful, charter schools be successful in implementing these new TEEKs in such a short amount of time? As it's been mentioned, these TEEKs go into effect 2022, 2023. That gives the school districts 1 full year to update not just sexual health education, but all the health education that's been updated. And so, but sex ed is our arena here. And so Texas is Ready is actually a website full of resources. In addition to the resources that we have at our website, texasisready.org, we are in partnership with the UT Health System in Houston. We are working with a framework infrastructure that they have in place, that is chock full of resources for school districts to go through and help choose curricula and help with parent opt-in forms and all the types of things that just help to streamline the process, which, you know, for a lot of people can be quite overwhelming if they were trying to do everything from scratch. So that's what we're trying to avoid. We're working with TASB and other organizations that that are just these large governing bodies over school districts, school boards, and things of that nature, so that we can trickle this information down and schools know that they have resources and they have support to be successful. They're not alone in trying to figure out how to do all of this on their own. So if you would, take notice on the right there. If you have your cell phones out and you want to go to TexasIsReady.org, you can kind of follow along with us. Jen is going to navigate to the website at this point so we can show you some of these awesome resources at the website itself. And while she's doing that, I will go ahead and drop the link that she referenced in the chat earlier, so we'll make sure to do that. Okay. So as we transition, you'll notice that the link is in the chat if you were interested in seeing the TEEX broken down by grade level, the areas that deal with domestic violence and sexual assault awareness and prevention. You'll find in that posted link there. So the cool thing about Texas is Ready is that it has resources for everyone. And we're on the back end, we're referring to them as toolkits. So as you can see on your screen there, it says parents, it says SHACs, students, school staff. What we're trying to do is tailor these toolkits so that the most relevant information, the most relevant resources are in place for those who need it. You're not trying to search through 1,000 things that don't apply to you. You can get to the things that you're interested in the most. So we have resources, we have more in-depth information. Today kind of was really high level, just kind of giving a really general overview of all the things. But if you're really interested in that policy, if you're really interested in those TEEX specifically, all that information is there in full for you. So as you can see here, the TeexTalk I spoke about a few minutes ago was at the bottom of the screen. You can get registered from that. For that, it's absolutely free. If you're interested in kind of getting the alerts for Texas is Ready along the homepage at the bottom of the home screen, you can put your information in there. You'll start getting emails to kind of keep up with the alerts or what's going on. So as you can see here, Jen has clicked into the resources for parents, right? So what does Texas state law say about sex education, right? A lot more detail about the process of sex education adoption in the schools. Jen gave a great overview, but we have these really awesome, well put together forms that just kind of like little one pagers that kind of give you all of the things right there, right? So if this was something that you wanted to just hand someone and say, hey, you know, I was in this really awesome presentation, right? It was so awesome. I was in this really awesome presentation today. I learned so much about sex ed in Texas. You know, here's an information sheet. You can print this right on out or just send them this link. And somebody can kind of just get a feel for all the things we've spoken about today, right? If you want to know, like I said, more in depth about the TEEX themselves, that was there. Public opinion polls that Jen just popped on the screen. So those cool little pie charts she had there, that last sheet she put up had those exact same graphics, but in addition to that, more of a breakdown of the areas of Texas that said what in those polls, right? Sex ed in Texas specifically, more about the TEEX there, the polling data. You can click view poll results. Myths and facts. We have myths and facts in a couple areas on the website as it pertains to specific groups and their interests. So in the parent page, there's myths and facts there as well. right? And so a lot of good information. I want Jen to take us to the blog. Jen has everyone really on the presenters here today have all contributed to the blog. Really, really good information. Really good reading material put together in a really fun way and easy to understand way about the way things are going on and why these changes are happening, why it's important, inclusivity, consent, all good things. So a great resource here, as I mentioned, the tool that we are working with UT Health with will potentially be housed here at TexasIsReady.org. If not, at a minimum, we'll have the link to that resource. We are currently updating it to reflect all the changes that have happened in the legislature recently. But what the premise is, what the purpose is to make sure that we help school districts, charter schools to be successful in implementing these new sexual health education teams. And so that in the end, we are giving our students in Texas what they need to be successful, to be healthy from head to toe. And so that is my spiel. That's my part. Oh, sorry. I speak so fast, y'all. I am so apologetic. If there were any questions, please, I'm seeing in the chat, please slow down. So sorry about that. If you have any questions, please throw them into the chat. Anything you want me to repeat, pop back on the screen. Any questions about the resource that I shared, the link that I shared, please go ahead and put them in the chat. If not, Jen, if you want to pop the presentation back up, we want to hear from you now. So like we just dumped some of everything on you all at once. And I know it may have been a little overwhelming, or you may just have some really good questions brewing about a specific area that we focused on today. Jen is going to pop some prompt type questions up to kind of get the wheels turning here, because what we want to do is figure out how we can be a better resource. What are we missing, right? So if you've had a chance to kind of explore the Texas is Ready website on your own a little bit just now, or just in the things you saw pop up on the screen, what are we missing? Like, how can we be more effective in helping you all be better advocates and helping your school districts and your communities get ready for this information and this type of education? Feel free to come off mute or to type it in the chat. You don't have to ask these questions specifically. If you have questions on your own, we welcome them.
And we did have one question about some of the sources for data around the efficacy of sex ed that you can use, for example, if you're advocating with your school board. One of the sources that we really like to go to are the position papers and the statements from the various medical organizations. Those tend to be very kind of well laid out and readable. So the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Pediatric Society, those medical groups that work around either reproductive health or child health, also Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine. They all have very strong, very well cited position statements on the efficacy of sex ed and why this type of abstinent sex ed is the most effective for changing outcomes. And then we got another question. Will this be for students in special ed also? That's a great question. So sex ed that is inclusive of students with, for example, IDD has been a topic that there's been a lot of interesting movement on. And Monica or Anthony, please feel free to jump in. To the extent that health teaks are delivered to an individual student who gets some special education services, that student would also get this additional content. To the extent that the student is in an instructional setting where they're not receiving the general teaks, then they would not receive this. The Texas campaign had a really great webinar in the last, I think, year and a half on sex ed inclusive of IDD. So could definitely offer that as a resource. And if any of the other presenters have anything else they'd like to jump in on that, feel free.
Thank you, Jen. I will speak about the people with disability, especially young people. Anthony and I have a huge interest in always improving that situation for them. Most school districts always automatically revert to the idea of, well, there's special populations, they have disabilities, they don't have a need to understand or learn sexual health education. We actually at Healthy Futures of Texas always encourage school districts to help these young people do receive this education, because they very much will grow up and live a life, and hopefully at one point or another may become sexually active. And because they are special populations, sometimes they are more unfortunately likely to be victims of a sexual assault, because they do maybe have a communication issue or are not very much aware of what is happening at the moment. So again, this is why we advocate to our school districts that we do work with and say, please do consider giving this education to your special populations, either special needs or disabled children in your school district, because they do very much do need this information. And at Healthy Futures of Texas, it is a target goal for us to improve tools for them, for teachers to be able to actually implement sexual health education for them. One of the things that we always say is you're going to teach them just the same way you're going to teach your other students, only most likely in a more slow manner, so that they can process the information in a more thorough manner. Anthony, please feel free to add anything else.
I think you've definitely covered the disability angle. What I might add, and potentially one of the most important things that you can take away from our talk today, is that, and I apologize to if anyone's heard this joke from me before, I use it every time, but there's no sex ed STAR test. So there's no, and probably for the better, but there's no way of knowing if schools are doing what they're supposed to do, if they're keeping their students with disabilities in mainstream classrooms, if they're covering all the TEKS they need to cover, if they're being compliant with the new standards. It requires all of us to look at the school down the street from us, where our cousin goes to school, whatever it might be, to make sure that this is being implemented. And I wanted to shout out, I get a notification whenever anyone signs in for more information on texasisready.org. Thank you to Anna for being the first person from today to do that. That's a great way to continue to get tools so that you can help to monitor the situation in your community.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one last thing before we close up, Jen. I just would like for you to share slide 26 so that people who want to advocate or start talking to their chats about positions, that they can easily screenshot that slide and utilize that. Some people were asking about that.
And then while we're doing this, we would love to use the last time that we have in the session to hear from you who do work so closely in this field and do this work on the ground and see the impact. And I'll go back to our question slide. What we'd really love to hear from you is what other resources do you need to be a champion for sex education in your local community, especially advocating around this healthy relationships piece that is so important for things like the prevention of sexual assault and domestic violence. You can either come off chat and just use your voice, or you're welcome to use the chat box. What resources would be helpful to you as an advocate? And we got a response, I've just started my agency and I've been told that we aren't even allowed to go into the schools. So I don't know where to start at all. And so we hear this from a lot of caseworkers and other youth serving professionals, that either their organizational policy tells them not to get anywhere near this topic of sex ed, or maybe there's the perception that they're not allowed to advocate or be a part of this. And so, definitely, if your organization has a policy, we would want you to honor that. What I always tell social workers, caseworkers, medical professionals is that you bring such rich experience and such good on the ground experience. I can go in as a policy nerd and I can talk to a legislator until I am blue in the face about data and research and statistics, and it does not do one bit of good. But if you get somebody going in, telling a real story about something that they truly encountered in their professional or personal life, that's what changes minds. So even if you can't engage with sex ed with your professional hat on, you can still use those stories and those experiences to advocate.
So I'll chime in on this because the last decade of my career has been very much on the ground, outreach, education, and this was absolutely one of our issues, is that we couldn't even get into most of the schools because of the abstinence-only education standards. It was, if you're not talking about abstinence only, don't even, just don't, right? So what we had to do was get really creative, and we had to figure out where our students were outside of school hours. So if that meant during the summer, we were working with the apartment complex, who was doing something around lunchtime where they were providing snacks for the kids or whatever the case may be. We were there, right? If we had the permission to be there, to come and share information, to come talk to the youth, hear what their needs are, their concerns, provide some education, we were there. If it was the alternative schools who had a little more leeway, they didn't have to follow the TeexTalk, they had their own standards that they were able to meet, and they allowed us to come in, then we were there. We were at the alternative schools. We were in the detention centers. We were anywhere we could be that we were allowed to provide this information and this education. So you can reach the youth and the young people in your communities, but it very well may not be within those four walls of their school building. You might have to really get creative. Apartment complexes are thebomb.com. A lot of them have community centers. They have things for the youth, especially in the summertime. That's a great place to start. Your local recreation centers are a great place to start. Yeah, I mean, just get creative. I've had educators who were in the laundromats. Like, I'm not even close to playing, giving parent education, talking to when parents were there, telling them why this was important and this, that, and the other, giving them tips on how to talk to their youth or young people in their life. I mean, if we'll get you, you know, it may not be in a traditional space, but we'll get to you if it's important enough for us to get this information out.
Monica, I know we're talking in the chat about that comment, but would you share a bit about how you do research on this topic in a school district?
Yes, thank you, Anthony. Anthony and I have worked together for a very, very long time, and he has watched me do this process of that very exact question. Where do I find this information of when the next shack is? Who's leaving the shack? And so that is the core of my work. And so when you are talking about a rural school district, it is clear that their website is not going to be as advanced and intricate as a Northside ISD in San Antonio School District's website is going to be. So I'm going to give you some key pointers that I've normally experienced. First off, shack is ultimately integrated under physical education, which is PE. So if you find the athletic director somewhere on that website, most likely somewhere on their page, there is going to be some information about the shack tied into that, especially in a rural school district website. However, you can also find it under the nurse department. It is one key point that the nurse at school districts are somewhat mandated by school districts to be involved with the shack because they are dealing with young people in a health manner. So they are most likely either involved or leading the shack. So if you can't find it on the website, call the high school, call the middle school, and ask to speak to the nurse. And just ask them, hey, I'm interested in serving in your shack. Do you know when the next shack meeting is? Do you know who's leading the shack? They normally, school districts have a school representative organize the shack meetings, and then they have a parent be the official leader of the shack committee. However, your best safe bet is to call the school district, ask to speak to the nurse or to the athletic director, and they will most likely answer your question and tell you this is who's leading it, or I'm leading it. The next meeting is on such date. One key point is the shacks are expected to meet at least 4 times a year. I've seen some wonderful websites where even before the end of the summer, they've already posted those 4 dates onto their school website. And then there's other school districts where they're really underfunded, and so they don't have someone to be able to tend to that. So it's really almost a Finding Nemo situation of find where the shack is and where it lives and who's leading it. But I assure you, just by asking a couple of questions to the school leaders, they'll tell you.
So, Stuart asked a good question. You actually do not have to be a parent to serve on the shack. You can just be a general community member and still serve on the shack.
And you can also definitely attend the meetings. I don't know about y'all, but I have enough on my calendar. So maybe not another committee, but I can go to the meeting.
And that, has become a lot easier now that a lot of shacks are meeting remotely. I went to a shack meeting recently in far West Texas, and I'm in Austin, and it was over Zoom, and,
I wanted to lift up a great point by Oralia in the chat. And this is something our colleague, Albert Trevino, talks a lot about. He used to be a school district person in the Valley. He talks a lot about work with the school district to understand, so that they can understand how this benefits them as well. Good sex ed improves school culture, which improves graduation rates. It's an ABC relationship. And you can take the approach that Aurelia mentioned about, talk about respect. Monica always talks about healthy. We want our young people to be healthy. These are great common areas that you can't really argue with. No one's going to say, I don't know, I want my teens to be unhealthy. Let's get more sodas in here. So you can take advantage of those common grounds. We've got about 9 minutes. If there's any other questions or comments, we'd love to hear what you're thinking about all this.
This is a really random question, but what was the significance of pointing out that the schools are now teaching the actual human testing instead of the scientific testing of something? It was a long time ago we talked about that.
So that's language that's been in the statute for decades and decades. The idea is that the schools always have and still have to teach what in statute they call human use reality rates, which in medical literature will often call like actual use effectiveness rates of contraception. So if you have a pack of birth control pills and you take it every single day at the same time, you might have a 1% failure rate. But if you kind of forget and you don't take it Thursday and then Friday you take it at midnight, right, you might have a 6% failure rate. And so there are different scoring metrics that the medical community uses for birth control methods, and that is what we have to teach. Oh, and Anthony raises a good point. Human use reality rates is not a medical term. The only place you will ever see that phrase is in Texas law or in reference to Texas law. The medical field uses a different set of terminology about that. But basically, the idea is we want youth to know not just how effective contraception is with perfect use, but how effective it is with how likely they actually are to use it. And we actually have very good research that suggests that adolescents have higher failure rates due to lack of compliance than adults do, which is why things like the arm implant or the IUD can be one good option for younger people.
I would add that is definitely, well, this is my guess, but that's probably in code to make people feel less confident in using contraception. Oh, it might fail. Maybe I shouldn't use it. But from my experience in the classroom, it's actually very helpful to explain condoms are 99% effective in a laboratory, but 86% effective in real life, because people think that you can, for example, use 2 and it's more protection, or they don't check expiration dates. So it can be a good tool for pulling apart some of the nuance of different contraception to make the education space stronger, actually.
JR has taught health education for many years, and she has some great stories about this, which may or may not be appropriate to share in this space, but.
No, definitely not all of them, but no. The thing about our youth, and y'all know this, I was reading as you were putting into the chat where you're from and how you work with youth. You work with youth long enough, you figure out that they're amazing. Young people are absolutely amazing, and they're so smart. And I think because social media is it just puts everything at their fingertips. They're so aware of what's going on around them. And I keep saying, like, gone are the days when young people are just sitting around waiting for adults to tell them what to do and to tell them what's going to happen with their lives. Like, they are heavily involved with speaking up and bringing awareness to what they want and what they think is important. So as part of advocacy, I would say make sure you include the young people. You don't have to fight this battle alone. If you really agree strongly with abstinence plus education, with inclusivity or what have you, get your young people involved. When we say network, we're not just talking about adult to adult and professional to professional. Get the young people involved. They came up, they showed up, and they showed out when it was time to testify and give testimony in front of the State Board of Education. The young people were in the building, and they were so captivating, and their messages were so powerful, and they were heard. And so if they think this is important for them, they might need your guidance, on the how. They could use some support from adults, but let them share the message. Let them be heard and help lift their voices, because really it's about them and their health. And a lot of them know what they want. They know that they don't want to be in the dark about their sexual health. They want to know what's going on with their bodies. And then those who have been left out of the current standards want to be included. And they want people to know how to include them. And so start there with advocacy. Start by teaming up with the younger people who this most affects. So we are at 11:56. If there are no other questions or comments, we thank you all for your time and for letting us come here before you today and share Texas is Ready and all the things about the policies and the legislative things that have gone into place. We hope that this information was helpful for you, and that we ask that you share it with the next person. Someone said this might sound too much, but is there anything in place for education for elementary school students? So that link that I shared in the chat, it does have a breakdown of the starting from the elementary level. And that link was specific to domestic violence and sexual assault, those particular areas of the TEEX that deal with that. But yes, so the health education starts from kindergarten on. And the great thing is that it is to be delivered, it's to be consumed at an age appropriate, developmentally appropriate level. And so that's the beauty of it. And if anybody knows about the talk, right, when it comes to sexual health education, it is not a one-time event. It is something that you should be doing with your young person from the time they are able to communicate with you, right? And so really good information out there. Anthony put some really good points of their safe touch, proper naming of body parts and things like that can start at a really young age and develop from there. And I'll give one more point for those who are still hanging around. The reason why proper named body parts are super important is because God forbid someone is touching that child inappropriately and they're trying to report it. You don't want them saying something like, oh, my uncle touched my bobo. Oh, okay, great. You know, I don't know what a bobo is. I'm thinking, I don't know if you're talking about a stuffed animal. I don't know what you're talking about. And I may not realize that you're trying to get my help on something really important. And that child may not disclose again. They may take that experience and think no one will help them. But if that child says, my uncle touched my vulva or my vagina or my penis, I know as an adult to react immediately. I know how to react and to go from there. And that child will then be heard and know that when they tell something like that, they're going to be heard and supported and protected. So that's just one example there. The evaluation link is up. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Monica, Jen, Anthony, and JR. The evaluation, Kara has put the evaluation link up there for this workshop. Please fill it out. I did want to let you all know that like I've already downloaded the link to the TeexTalk resource that JR put in the text chat, and I'll send it and we'll get it put up on the website so that you can also download it from there along with the PowerPoint slides. And again, that'll all be available in about a week. But thank you all so much. Really great stuff, really great conversation, important conversation. And take a 30-minute break and we'll see. Oh, actually a little bit longer. It's lunch break. So we'll see everyone back at 1:30. And enjoy your lunch.